Hi, everyone. Um, well, this is the introductory video for Uprooting Racism by Paul Kivel. Uh, Hopefully the beginning of quite a good conversation. So if you have any comments, please leave them down below and I'll try to get to them. And if you want to, schedule a Zoom meeting to have a more direct conversation, let's consider doing that as well. But as an introduction to the book, you can see I'm using the third edition. There's a fourth edition out. And I took a little bit of a look at it, and there's some changes. I'm not sure how important the changes are. Those of you with fourth edition, please let me know. But, I just think that this might be a good introduction, good place for us to start. What do I hope to accomplish by working through this book? Well, I first bought this book 5 years ago and kind of been working on it myself, occasionally introducing topics during my sermons, but I'm really interested in, having a group to finally work through it with. So I just hope to have conversations with you all. I'm also interested in finding out what you hope to accomplish. I think some of what Kivel has us do is important and kind of difficult work, but we'll see as the time unfolds. I think it's important to consider what Kivel himself has said about this book. And I happened to find a YouTube video of him talking about this book. So let's see, I need to share computer sound so that you'll be able to hear it. So here's what Mr. Kivel has to say himself.
I'm Paul Kivel, and I'm the author of a new expanded version of Uprooting Racism, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice. I wrote the new version because, on the one hand, we live in a time when people are saying racism is over with. The civil rights movement took care of that with a black president. What more could we accomplish? We must live in a post-racial society. And yet the evidence is stark and devastating that in every area of our society, people of color are living segregated lives, poorer lives, less access to education, housing, healthcare, and other basic needs, and more vulnerable to exploitation and violence. So we need to face that reality. It's a time when we can't afford to ignore that. As we go through an economic crisis, environmental crises, war, and militarism, that people of colors, communities of colors are being very hard hit by these systems. I wrote the book to talk about how you and I can step up as allies, as white allies for racial justice. The book contains lots of exercises, examples, stories, because there's been a long history of white people stepping up for racial justice, going back to the abolition movement and defenders of Native American rights and the civil rights movement, and standing with immigrants and more recently. And standing up as allies is something that we can all take on. It's not an identity so much as a practice. It's something that you and I can do every day in our families, our workplaces, classrooms, neighborhoods, communities, religious institutions. Wherever we are, we can look around and say, is there equal opportunity here? Is everybody being invited to participate? What are the racial dynamics that are happening? And so the new edition of Uprooting Racism is a practical and accessible guide for each of us to use to guide our actions and joining the community of people working for racial justice in our society.
One thing you'll notice that was 9 years ago. This fourth edition, I think, is just a year or two old. But we've been doing this for quite a while. And in fact, you'll see from what Mr. Kivel's statement here from his book says, it's been going on for quite a while. Kivel writes that this is a book about racism for white people. In this book, I want to talk to you personally about what racism means to those of us who are white and how we can make a difference in the struggle for racial justice. For the last 35 years, his work, my work, has been driven by one powerful question. How can we live and work to sustain community, nurture each other, and create a multicultural society based on love, justice, and interdependence with all living things? I feel strongly a challenge posed in that question is the most important one we face today. So Mr. Kivel's been working on this for over 35 years. This was almost 10 years ago, so 45 years. It can be a little depressing to think how long a struggle this has been. I mean, wow. I mean, white folks got to look at it from Black perspective. It's been a several hundred-year struggle. But what we're dealing with is a fundamental shift in culture, fundamental shift in society. And yeah, those things take quite a while. But I really found this question interesting, thought-provoking. And he calls it one question, but we actually have three questions here. How can we live and work to sustain community? How can we live and work to nurture each other? How can we live and work to create a multicultural society based on love, justice, and interdependence with all living things? Wow, that is a tall order, but what an incredible vision of possibilities. I mean, I am a Christian pastor, and this speaks so much to the hope that I read in Scripture, the promise that Revelations almost gives us at the end of community united under God's justice. How do we begin? Kivel suggests that we white people come to understand ourselves as white people. That may not seem particularly shocking, or it may, but here's what Kivel says. I'm talking to you as one white person to another. I am Jewish, and I will talk about that later in this book. You also may have an ethnic identity you are proud of. You likely have a religious background, a culture, a country of origin, and a history. Whatever your other identities, you may not be used to being addressed as white. And that's why, in the question I posed, I specified what we white people come to understand ourselves as white people. Kivel continued, other people are African American, Asian American, Pacific Islanders, Native American, Latino or Latinas, or Muslims. Other people have countries of origin and primary languages that are not English. Rarely in the US do white people identify ourselves or each other as white. It's an adjective that is seldom heard explicitly, but is everywhere implied. People are assumed white unless otherwise noted, much as people and animals are assumed to be male. Now, Kivel wants us to understand, or I think more accurately, realize that whiteness is considered the default setting. It's such a fundamental assumption in our society that we hardly even give it a thought, let alone a second thought. And so he asks us to read these following lines. He walked into a room and immediately noticed her. This new sitcom is about middle-aged, middle-class couple and their 3 teenage children. And, statements, sentences continue. Kivel's asking us just to simply read that. And then he asks us, are all these people white? Read the sentences again and imagine the people referred to as Chinese Americans or Native Americans. How does that change the meanings of these sentences? If you're of Christian background, which I am, what happens when you make them Jewish or Muslim? So again, let's read these sentences again with a thought in mind, people of color, different cultures, different nationalities, indigenous people. And what immediately strikes me is the very first sentence. He walked into the room and immediately noticed her. When I first read it, the natural assumption of white people, it could have been the beginning of a romance novel of some sort. Uh, but with the cultural up, upbringing that I've had, when I consider this in terms of a person of color, he walked into the room and immediately noticed her. Well, to my mind, that sets up much greater problems uh, than just basically assuming that it's a white guy um, and noticing some probably white woman. Um, but yeah, he walked into the room and immediately noticed her. Well, I want to give you a moment, and maybe one of these other sentences really strike you as, well, shocking. If you go between the white and colored, white and Christian and Muslim, whatever distinction you want to make, how does changing our assumptions about the people referred to change the way we understand the sentences? Let's continue. Another way of putting this is, why notice? What's the point of saying, I'm white? Well, consider how whiteness is the basic default setting for our society. People of color spend most of their lives being reminded of their skin color. What is it like for us to take some time to focus on our skin color? And Kivel writes, white people have been led to believe that racism is a question of particular acts of discrimination or violence. Calling someone a name, denying someone a job, excluding someone from a neighborhood, that is racism. These certainly are acts of racism. But what about working in an organization where people of color are paid less? They have more menial work or fewer opportunities for advancement. What about shopping in a store where you are treated respectfully, but people of color are followed around or treated with suspicion? People of color know this racism intimately. They know that where they live, work, and walk, whom they talk with and how, what they read, listen to, or watch on TV, their past experiences and future possibilities are all influenced by racism. But again, why focus on our whiteness? Well, I found this comment from Kivel fascinating and really quite true. Kivel writes that I want to begin here with this denial of our whiteness because racism keeps people of color in the limelight and makes whiteness invisible. Now, where this quote comes from, he had just talked about the extent to which white people deny their whiteness, come up with every sort of way of looking at others and uh, uh, putting the attention off of us and our whiteness, because it's really quite uncomfortable. But racism keeps people of color in the limelight and makes whiteness invisible. One thing that needs to be said, and he mentions it throughout the passages in his book, is that we're not talking about white supremacists here. I don't think anybody I know is a white supremacist. So, those sorts of folks, I think, constantly focus on their whiteness and how great and powerful and right their whiteness is. But what we're dealing with is society, society's basic default mode, default setting, that whiteness is fundamental and normal and what's to be expected. If that's true, which I think it is, if that's true, then so much of racism is really taking the focus off whiteness. Whenever we try to turn a conversation around to the people of color, focusing on them, the ways in which they are given the limelight. Well, what does that say about Black Lives Matter? Putting colored folks in the limelight. To change this was take whiteness itself, hold it up to the light, and see that it is a color too. Whiteness is a concept and ideology which holds tremendous power over our lives and in turn over the lives of people of color. Challenge will be to keep whiteness center stage. Every time our attention begins to wander off toward people of color or other issues, we will have to notice and refocus. Okay, yeah, so, here I am taking a quote out of context. And the context again was this habit that white folks have of, putting the attention off of us and off of our whiteness and putting it on people of color. So we need to come to terms, accept the fact that, this isn't talking about things like Black Lives Matters. This is talking about what we see all too often. When the comment Black Lives Matter is said, a lot of white folks say, no, all lives matter. And yeah, well, again, thought this really fascinating, thought-provoking. What do you think? All right, well, I don't want these videos to get too long. There's a lot going on in the book. But as a first start, I think it's really important to recognize Kivel wants us to start just thinking about our whiteness. So homework is to try to remind yourself as often as you can throughout the day that you are white. And as you're doing that, reflect upon whatever feelings may arise out of that. And notice how rarely you hear the words white or Caucasian. Notice your surroundings and the degree to which multiple cultures and or skin colors are or are not represented. That is, wherever you find yourself during the day, just take a moment and stop and look around. Probably going to be surrounded by a lot of white people. I know here in Shenango County, yeah, a lot of white people. But most importantly, what I want you to do is talk to each other about these things. Again, leave comments down below. Folks who know me know my email address. So, email me, text me, whatever. Let's get a conversation going. See where this will lead us to. I don't think it'll be a bad place at all. I think it can only be positive as we engage in these conversations. So, hey, there's your introduction. Let's see where it goes from here. Blessings to you all.